Hello, my name's Jonathan Pugh, and I'm leading the Anthropocene Islands initiative, which is concerned with why and how the figure of the island has risen to such dramatic prominence in broader Anthropocene thinking, whether that's critique, knowledge, or more mainstream policy practices. And in these times, I thought it would be useful to record a talk which outlines how my own work, along with that of David Chandler, is approaching this question of why and how the figure of the island has risen to such prominence in recent years. In the past, small islands, were very much on the periphery of international debate. So why is it that when you pick up Anthropocene scholarship and policy-making practices today, the figure of the island and islanders have emerged so prominently? In this talk, as I say, we're just going to outline one way of approaching that, how we've been thinking that question through. It's only one way. There are clearly many ways of unpacking why this is taking place, and indeed that's the reason for setting up the Anthropocene Island Initiative more generally. What David and I are doing is in the process of publishing our own particular way of approaching the question in the forthcoming Anthropocene Islands, A Critical Agenda for Island Studies in the Anthropocene book, which is coming out in 2021, and a series of shorter publications, such as the one I'm going to draw upon today, which is also coming out in 2021 in the journal Dialogues in Human Geography. This paper will also be a subject of a debate forum in that journal next year, in 2021, in which various people will respond to how we're engaging the stakes of the dramatic rise to prominence of islands within broader Anthropocene thinking. So, as I say, we're going to outline our approach to how islands have emerged as emblematic figures for the generation and development of Anthropocene thinking. Many Anthropocene scholars provide us with the key take-home message that they are writing after the end of the world. Not because they're necessarily writing about apocalypse, but because they're engaging the Anthropocene after the profound crisis of faith in Western modernity, which has increasingly come to prominence in recent decades. For many contemporary Anthropocene thinkers, artists, activists, and policymakers, modern frameworks of reasoning, which claim to separate out humans from nature, to be able to grasp the world as a coherent, controllable, and manageable object, are part of the problem rather than the solution. In the Anthropocene, relational entanglements and feedbacks are understood to be too rich, too vibrant and complex to be commanded in this modern way. Indeed, it is widely noted that the question of how to live in a world shaped by relational entanglements and feedbacks is the problematic of contemporary Anthropocene thinking. Here, Derrida resonates powerfully when he says that once faith in modern reasoning collapses, we are faced with the stark realization that there is no world, there are only islands. Derrida's argument focused upon forwarding deconstruction as a method or approach for challenging the metaphysical claims of modern philosophy. For Derrida, islands were key framing devices and the most obvious spaces of disruptive relations, which work against modernity's requirement of coherence and its metaphysical grounding propositions. But in this talk, we significantly expand upon Derrida's observation, because we analyse how work with islands has become productive in the development of many of the core conceptual frameworks of Anthropocene thinking more generally. Islands, long understood as emblematic liminal and transgressive spaces, have become key resources, drawn upon in the generation of a great deal of Anthropocene thinking, suggesting powerful alternatives to hegemonic, modern, mainland, or one world thinking. Given that relational entanglement is the central problematic of the Anthropocene, it was perhaps inevitable that island geographical forms, practices, orientations, and imaginaries would come to the fore. As Donna Haraway says, it matters which thoughts think thoughts. Compared to islands, other geographical forms, like valleys, deserts, and mountains, seem to do less productive work when it comes to developing the problematic of relational entanglements. Thus, islands have become generative for Anthropocene thinking concerned with global warming, rising sea levels, and the legacies of colonialism, the fallouts of mainland Western consumerism, nuclear fallout and testing, climate migration, intensified hurricanes, and ocean acidification. And these, of course, are just some of the many ways in which the island has become arguably the emblematic figure of the Anthropocene. Importantly, as we explain in this talk, islands were already grasped as liminal spaces, lacking modernity's coherence and uniformity. Increasingly, however, these liminal and transgressive qualities are seen to be positively rather than negatively in the Anthropocene. The island power of relational entanglement had already been drawn out generatively prior to the awareness of the Anthropocene, illustrated variously from Darwin and Wallace to Mead, to Gleason, Brathwaite, Strathern and Hofer. This generative and disruptive power is widely recognised today in how islands are constituted in both Islander and Western scholarship and research. For those concerned with the hubris and counterproductive nature of modern frameworks of reasoning, the problem is the exclusion of relation and focus upon essences and linear or universal causality. The relations and feedbacks associated with the Anthropocene are widely held to be masked by and hidden from a reductionist modern ontology and epistemology. In debates about the Anthropocene, island life rises to the fore and is regularly invoked as having a different set of capacities, affordances, and potentialities to modern or mainland life. Islands are held to exemplify how all life is relationally entangled and codependent. Now, of course, not all Anthropocene thinking chooses to explicitly engage the geographical form of the island. But as we explain, a concern with island orientations, entanglements, affordances, and feedbacks surfaces regularly enough for enough people in enough wider debates about the Anthropocene to indicate that islands are particularly productive for contemporary Anthropocene thinking. To be clear, in this talk we're not going to say that there is such a thing as island thinking. There are, of course, only variations of ways of drawing upon and working with islands in different places and at different times in history. Under older European and modern thought, the island was often understood as insular, isolated and backward, when compared to continental mainland reasoning. Building directly from these older narratives, in more recent debates about climate change, islands are still often reductively framed in Western and modernist fantasies of control, understood as backward, helpless or vulnerable, and in need and saving by others. Islands, of course, are often portrayed as passive victims, waiting to be saved from their sinking islands. But we think debate is also changing. The island is being productively rethought, worked with, and drawn upon in the generation of contemporary Anthropocene thinking. Thus, in this talk, we are going to draw out heuristically and examine in detail the work of thinking and working with islands after the end of the world. The approach we take, to be clear, is less one of advocating what island thinking and practices should be in Anthropocene thinking, and more about heuristically drawing out and analysing the ways in which these conceptualizations are today developed in the Anthropocene. Working with islands or relational thought per se is, of course, not one homogeneous other to modernist or mainland approaches. And so we think it's really important to start this conversation about how we engage in working through the rich variety of possibilities and opportunities that island-oriented approaches afford today. In order to initiate this process, in this talk we're going to carve out 4 tendencies or analytics, which position the figure of the island centrally within broader debates about the Anthropocene. These are what we call resilience, patchworks, correlation, and storiation. They mark out 2 sets of conceptual sliding scales, which, in the first half of the talk, focus upon ontology, which is resilience and patchworks, and in the second half, what we call onto-epistemology, which is correlation and storiation. And we'll conclude by opening up what this means for a critical agenda for island studies in the Anthropocene going forward. Throughout, we will analyse how the emergence of these four island analytics draws heavily upon islands as a reserve of non-modern modes of interdependence, relation and feedback, facilitating alternatives to modernist framings of linear causality, universality and homogeneity. Abstracting from specific authors and works, we draw upon a wide range of examples in order to illustrate how island imaginaries of human-world relations are generative of alternative methodological approaches in the Anthropocene. As I say, in the conclusion, we will explain how our initial set of four analytics distinctions could serve to spark discussion about a broader critical agenda for island studies. Thus, and to be absolutely clear again, we just see this talk as a starting point. The book that we're producing and the papers we're producing are just the beginnings of an opening for a project or an initiative, what we're calling Anthropocene Islands, focusing upon conceptually and heuristically exploring ways of working with islands in contemporary Anthropocene thinking, and how this could become the beginning for a wider discussion, reflecting upon how island scholarship opens up the Anthropocene as a problematic more broadly. As just noted, the approaches to relational ontology examined in this paper are heuristically conceptualised in two modes, those of resilience, which is closest to systems theoretical approaches, and what we call patchworks, working on a more transitory understanding of connection and effect. As a brief summary of their key characteristics before we get into the details, resilience draws out how the resilient capacities of life, often exemplified in discourses of island life, are part and parcel of spatially and temporally fixed assemblages, with autonomous capacities for self-ordering or adaptation, whether these are communities or islands of interactive socio-ecological systems. Resilience thus traces and responds to relational entanglements, affordances and feedback effects over space and time. Central here is how resilience thinking draws upon the immanent interactive powers of life itself, again often exemplified in debates by island life as a self-regulating system. As we will shortly elaborate, for us, this is a key reason why islands and islanders have emerged as particularly high-profile bounded spaces for resilience thinking in debates about the Anthropocene. Because, as the naturalists Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace found in developing their theories of evolution, islands are remarkable localised sites of relational entanglements and feedback effects. What we are calling patchwork ontologies, which we see as a variation and development upon resilience, are also increasingly prevalent in debates about the Anthropocene. These approaches characterise the work of many scholars, experimental artists, designers and activists today engaged with debates about the Anthropocene. They similarly draw heavily upon the power of islands, for grounding ontological tropes of relational entanglement and feedback effects. But, importantly, in contrast to resilience, patchwork approaches have a much more open ontology of spatial and temporal becoming. They do not draw upon an imaginary of islands existing as self-regulating systems, tracing continuities in relation across linear time into an ever more efficient order, as in resilience. Thus, patchwork ontologies locate the human subject as inside relations of interactive becoming, rather than as a scientific observer manipulating or directing processes from above. In patchworks as a flatter ontology, the task is a more interactive one of responsively staying with the trouble, as Haraway would say. Now, whilst therefore patchwork approaches thus align with a great deal of contemporary critical theory associated with the Anthropocene, our key argument in this talk, which we will demonstrate, will be that one geographical form which is doing some of the most important work in these debates is the figure of the island. So now to turn to resilience in more detail. Resilience has without doubt become the analytical field through which islands have emerged as central to less modern command and control, top-down framings of governance, with linear thinking about progress and sustainability. In the Anthropocene, resilience has emerged as a key conceptual innovation, focusing upon governance as the art of adaptation or of adaptive change in relation to changing circumstances. At the ontological level, resilience approaches could be understood as reflecting a shift towards tapping into immanent powers of complex adaptive systems. Rather than exporting or imposing external resources, knowledge, or assistance, it is the relational or contextual powers of affordances of these actors and agencies which is the key strengths to be drawn upon in resilience thinking. Whereas modernity was seen to homogenise and reduce life to the lowest common denominator, repressing any form of being outside the norm. By contrast, drawing upon engaging and working with islands has been absolutely central to the rise of resilience thinking, because islands are imagined to have the opposite powers, the powers of creative and productive differentiation and individuation. But what enables islands rather than mainlands to illustrate the power of immanence, to intensify relationalities, differentiation and individuation? What is the island ontology that is being orientated towards? Here we can turn to Darwin and the creative power he attributed to islands in his paradigm-shifting perspective of life itself, not only exemplified but revealed to the rest of the world by island life. Darwin famously theorised the radiating vibrancy of life in the form of a branching evolutionary tree, where different environmental opportunities enabled different answers to the problems of life. Species evolved and adapted differently on the Galapagos, because different island ecologies facilitated and enabled this differentiation. The key word for Darwin was thus divergence, which emerged from the separation and bounded nature of islands. And in focusing upon this, he drew the world's attention to how islands are powerful differentiating engines for life itself. Darwin explained how island life reveals how all life is interactive and profoundly relational, with each island context drawing out different potentials. Darwin was obsessed with the power of islands, this island effect. Thus, as Quinlan says, with mockingbirds, these grey, long-beaked birds differ from island to island, but so subtly, and they seem to have diverged from one stock. Diverged, 3 kinds of mockingbird, varying slightly, this island to that. Yes, they all appeared distinct but similar, in a way that suggested relatedness. If that impression were true, Darwin confided to Henslow, his Cambridge biology professor, confessing an intellectual heresy, such facts would undermine the stability of the species. Darwin's work on islands brought the world's attention to the differentiating, creative and adaptive potentialities of life itself. For Darwin, cats on an island, like tiny lizards on a Croatian island, or the finches on the Galapagos, do not evolve to become better cats per se, but better cats for catting on that particular island. Darwin's heresy was to overturn the idea that evolutionary speciation is linear, or the unfolding of some essence of cat being, but rather non-linear, and instead to do with the relational context of island cat becoming, or island cat emerging. Species do not evolve in the sense of a linear hierarchy or a telos of progress. Since Darwin's time, island life has become a symbol of non-linear emergence and diversification, because islands are seen to enable context to intensify and magnify interactive feedback effects. In this way, as Gregory Bateson acknowledged, the subject of evolution is no longer an isolated or autonomous one, but the organism plus environment, organism in its environment. The creative attributes of life, exemplified above all by island life, are absolutely central to resilience thinking, because they demonstrate that adaptation to change is not only possible, but is an ontologically inherent power of life itself. Resilience policymaking is thus orientated around designing for relational adaptation, rather than about planning, predicting, regulating and controlling in a modern way. Resilience is not about perfecting the essence of entities, but about understanding capacities in relation to other agencies. Without Darwin's understanding of how island life itself works, resilience theories based upon systems ecologies would not, and simply could not, have emerged in the way they did. Examinations of island life were thereby frequently at the heart of early case studies of resilience. As the highly influential resilience scholar C.S. Holling noted in an interview about the resilience programs which he initiated, quote, When we considered whether someone would be good for the programme, the first question we'd ask was, is he, she, good on islands? Islands increasingly became generative as both laboratories of Western science and as key sites of creative adaptation, relational affordances and feedback effects. Key developments in resilience understandings drew upon extensive island research, including in the early days in Fiji, the Caribbean and Papua New Guinea. Foregrounding islands as intensive sites of relational entanglements, affordances and feedbacks effects crucially reverses the epistemological and governing hierarchies of island versus mainland. It challenges the top-down, modern and external centralisation of power and off-island. Instead, switching the focus of attention to the active possibilities and relational potentialities of life itself, exemplified in many debates by island life. Now today, of course, it's commonplace for international policymakers, academics and practitioners to work with islands in these ways, and to highlight how we can all learn from island life and islanders' capacities for resilience. Islanders and islands are understood as this resource because they appear to be literally generative of new and creative forms of life. Resilience as a mode of governance seeks to learn from and to replicate these generative powers, seen in the potentialities of island life. It seeks to direct, instrumentalise and governmentalise approaches, often illustrating how the resilient capacities of life are part and parcel of whole sociological ecosystems. Thus, it's become ubiquitous in the literature to argue that islanders' knowledge systems include these valuable insights on a range of things like seasonal cycles or ecological processes, and for the management of biocultural diversity, but are relevant at a broad range of scales for understanding resilience and adaptability. Island life is widely understood as constituting a living system that the rest of the world may learn from, exemplifying the creative potentialities or emergent powers of life itself, system effects, that cannot be accessed directly by way of modern frameworks of reasoning. Working with islands has historically been, and today remains, dominant and fundamental to resilience as a key ontology and analytic for many concerned with contemporary Anthropocene thinking. Now, while resilience works with fixed spatial and temporal understandings of system interaction, a more fluid grasp of relational ontology can be heuristically grasped in terms of patchwork approaches, which, as I noted, are prevalent in the work of many contemporary Anthropocene scholars, experimental artists, designers, and activists. Patchwork approaches develop and disrupt the island ontology of resilience thinking, so that the more modernist imaginary of islands existing in a flat, one-dimensional space side by side, tracing continuities in relation across linear time, is replaced with a more open island ontology of spatial and temporal becoming. Working with islands is radicalised in patchwork approaches, destabilising the solutionist or instrumentalising aspects of resilience, making patchwork approaches more open, less governmentalising and human-centred. From Marilyn Strathern, famously, many people across the world, exemplified by Melanesian islanders, who are the interlocutors for Strathern, do not construct their existence in terms of modernity's human nature divide. What Strathern called these Melanesian cyborgs see themselves as intricately part of relations, where, to quote, she says, one personal relationship exists cut out of or as an extension of the other. Conversely, these extensions, relationships and connections are integrally part of the person. They are the person's circuit, end quote. And this is widely reflected in Melanesian island culture for Strathern. So that, again, to quote, there is no difference between shell strands and matrilineage, between a man and a bamboo pole, between yam and a spirit. The one is the other, insofar as they equally provoke the perception of relations. The different components or figures are thus all parts of persons, or relationships fixed onto one another. For example, the flutes that both are children and produce children, or spirits that are both within and beyond the body form of persons. Melanesians have a culture facility for presenting their extensions of themselves to themselves, a facility for, we could put it, moving without travelling, end quote. Now, these islanders are therefore non-modern through and through, and this is how Strathern distinguishes them from Haraway's cyborg. Quote, "The distinction between the Melanesian cyborg and Haraway's half-human, half-mechanical contraption is that the components of the Melanesian cyborg are conceptually cut from the same material." End quote. What is key for Strathern about Melanesian island cultures, and for the development of more recent patchwork ontologies in Anthropocene thinking that we'll shortly turn to, is that the creative act of severance, the burst of information that makes one person visible as an extended part of another. Thus, for Strathern, it is not merely that people and things are cobbled together as hybrids or cyborgs of human-non-human relations. Rather, exemplified by these island cultures, what exists on the island already emerges from the perception of a common background to all movement and activity. Such anthropological studies are, of course, widespread today, where island cultures offer us insights into worlds which cannot be reduced to the binaries which sustain the modernist imaginary, the subject-object, mind-body, human nature divides. Given what we have just been saying, it's, of course, no surprise that many leading contemporary anthropologists, like Anna Singh, have recently explicitly chosen to focus their research on islands and islanders. Here, an island-orientated relational ontology foregrounds the ongoing processes of engaging relational entanglements, emergencies, disturbances, and effects. As Singh makes clear in her highly influential The Mushroom at the End of the World, working with islands and islanders brings to the fore the localised configurations and co-shapings of relations, which cannot be grasped by formalised and abstract modern reasoning and interventions. Singh's famous study of Japanese islanders cultivating matsutake mushroom is a very good example of patchwork ontologies coming to the forefront of contemporary thought and Anthropocene thinking. Exploring the relationship between people, landscapes and mushrooms, Singh follows the commodity chain of the matsutake mushroom from North America and China to the islands of Japan. In contrast to what is seen as the modern hubris of North American and Chinese practices, which separate humans from nature, for Singh it is above all the Japanese concept of Satayama woodlands which offers us the most hope in the Anthropocene. And I quote, "Satayama are traditional peasant landscapes, combining rice agriculture and water management with woodlands. The woodlands, the heart of the Satayama concept, were once disturbed and thus maintained, through their use for firewood and charcoal making, as well as non-timber forest products. Today, the most valuable product of Satayama woodland is matsutake. To restore woodlands for matsutake encourages a suite of other living things, pines and oaks, understory herbs, insects, birds. Restoration requires disturbance, but disturbance to enhance diversity and the healthy functioning of ecosystems. Some kind of ecosystems, advocates argue, flourish with human activities." End quote. For Singh, humans and other forms of life are intricately entangled through such islands of interconnection, which are brought to the surface via momentary or contingent disturbances and effects, and each island requires the care of constant and delicate reconfiguration to engender these creative processes. Here, working with island ontology in terms of relations and feedback effects thus shapes an understanding of the world as a pluriverse of multiple or many worlds. And in patchwork ontologies, this is associated with looking at concrete interactions in specific moments and often rich ethnographic research, enabling us to see the creativity in the everyday. For Singh, in these ways, the practices of Satayama become a radical tool for decentering the hubris of modern reasoning, which seeks to manage nature in a more top-down and goal-orientated ways. Singh continues, I quote, "One Japanese scientist explained matsutake as a result of unintentional cultivation, because human disturbance makes the presence of matsutake more likely, despite the fact that humans are entirely incapable of cultivating the mushroom. Indeed, one could say that pines, matsutake, and humans all cultivate each other unintentionally. They make each other's world-making projects possible. The idiom has allowed me to consider how landscapes more generally are a product of unintentional design. That is, the overlapping world-making activities of many agents, human and non-human. The design is clear in the landscape's ecosystem, but none of the agents have planned this effect. Humans join others in making landscapes of unintentional design." End quote. This focus upon unintentionality effects and disturbances rather than instrumentality, is clearly different from the solutions thinking of those who seek to draw upon and develop island powers of resilience. Indeed, for such patchwork approaches as Singh's, solution thinking would be a barrier to the need to be constantly attuned, alert, and responsive to emergent life and effects. Neither is the power of interactive island life understood in terms of self-regulating, harmonious systems which tend towards order. The promise of order or solutions would be too modernist, denying our entangled responsibilities and commitments, while greater sensitivity to effects and disturbances enable us to become increasingly aware of them. Now, patchwork thinking with islands is therefore productive, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the work of the Caribbean scholar Edouard Glissant, who we see as a forerunner of this ontological approach. Here, Glissant's argument is that life, again exemplified for him above all by island life, is a coming to consciousness within what he calls the opacity of relation. Conceptually speaking, for Glissant, relation is not actually an entity as such, which could be transparently grasped and instrumentalized in the ways of modern reasoning or resilient island thinking. Relation is instead the very process or movement itself, living through and with the disturbances and effects of colonial legacies, island geographies, oceanic currents, elemental forces, and everything else that are formed and continuously reformed to make up life, exemplified for Glissant by the islands of the Caribbean. In Glissant's work, which examined the Middle Passage, creolization, and the Caribbean, he argued that these islands were, quote, explosive regions where relation, quote, is gathering strength. For Glissant, modern continental frameworks of reasoning had reductively and oppressively focused upon how it was possible to grasp the world, so that the verb to grasp, as he says, contains the movement of the hands that grab their surroundings and bring them back to themselves, again exemplified by the grasping hand of colonialism on islands. By contrast, Glissant more radically opened up an engagement with relation, pushing relational thinking with islands to the point that we can never stand outside and grasp, only ever contemplate and explore what he calls the texture of the weave, living with and through the turbulences and relational effects. John Drabinski has recently underscored the centrality of thinking with islands to Glissant's whole approach, highlighting, quote, that Glissant's literary and theoretical work consistently engages with the image of the botanical geographic meaning of the mangrove in order to characterise the polyrooted rhizomic character of Antilles. For Robertson Stevens, engaging Glissant's more productive way of thinking with islands provides us with what they call an anti-explorer method, which we understand as a powerful patchwork approach to contemporary Anthropocene thinking. This challenges the idea of the white male island explorer who, quote, sallies forth with confidence that if the world is as yet unknown, then it at least may be surveyed and hence known via Euclidean geometry. But for Robertson Stevens, Glissant instead works with the infinite island, a maelstrom, a place constituted by infinitely large numbers of analytical frames, moving towards infinitely minute. This foregrounds how Glissant's thinking with islands is a practical one, in which the subject no longer stands apart, outside, or above as an observer or grasper of relations, but rather practically worlds themselves, expanding their world in embedded and embodied ways which cannot be known in advance. For such patchwork ontologies, islands are therefore not merely worlds we are in, but rather within. As authors as diverse as Glissant, Phil Hayward, Robertson Stevens, Anna Singh, and Mimi Scheller draw out, islands are also ways of expressing and understanding our own processes of world making. Thinking with islands, as T. O'Air famously said, then importantly becomes a verb, not a noun. A practice of opening ourselves out to relational effects and knots of correlational entanglements, rather than one of resilience, which works at the other end of the sliding scale or spectrum, which tends to reify the world and subordinate us to it. In patchwork ontologies, the focus is upon how we make, explore, and journey, rather than merely reflect upon and become more aware of our relational interconnections, so as to become more resilient. It's less instrumentalizing and governmentalizing patchwork approaches. The central focus of patchwork approaches is Glissant's famous giving on and with, the power of disturbances and emergent effects, where in the work of many influential Anthropocene scholars, activists, artists, and experimental designers today, Island ontology becomes a key resource to draw upon, and for stimulating thinking about how relationality is radically open and contains potentialities or possibilities which are beyond our capacities to predict or to control. As a final brief example of an influential patchwork approach for Anthropocene thinking, we can turn to Deborah Bird-Rowe's engagement with the Australian Aboriginal aesthetic of shimmer, which pervades many aspects of Aboriginal island life. For example, and I quote Bird-Rowe's, "At an ecological scale in northern Australia, one of the most obvious patterns is the pulse between wet and dry seasons. The desiccation of the dry season dulls the landscape in many ways, although the country is always beautiful. There is a winding back of fertility, a loss of water, and thus loss of possibility for sun to glint on the water. But then things begin to move towards brilliant again. The lightning starts and sparks things up. The rain starts to bring forth shiny green roots, and rainbows offer their own kind of brilliance. Shimmer comes with new growth, the everything coming new process of shininess and health, and the new generations." Now, what's important for shimmer, for Bird-Rowe's, is that the past does not exist as a lack, as a stepping stone to march on from, as in the telos of modernity, with its linear understandings of progress, development, and time. Rather, shimmer is a form of expansive amplification of the richness and complexity of these island relations, which does not understand the world as being, to quote Bird-Rowe's, composed of gears and cogs, but of multifaceted, multi-species relations and pulses, end quote. For Bird-Rowe's, only in this way can we bring out the full potentiality of life, exemplified by this island life in Australia, its diversity, complexity, abundance, and beauty. Rather than a universal modern theory of progress, where the past was always a necessary moment fixing the determination of the present, for such patchwork ontologies, the past is an inexhaustible resource for holding out transformative hope in the present, and for an ethics of care. Again, to quote Bird-Rowe's, "For shimmer to capture the eye, there must be an absence of shimmer. To understand our absence bring forth, it must be understood not as a lack, but as potential." This is why there is a need to expand thinking with islands into a focus upon the richness and depth of relation. Everything in relation on the island becomes a possibility. In this short talk, relatively short talk, we can only focus upon a few examples of patchwork ontologies, and in the book we discuss many, many more, including Phil Hayward's development of the archipelago concept, Dea and Perez Roma's examination of how the island has become a design tool in scales ranging from gardens to cities to regions in the Anthropocene, Juliana Sparr's Hawaiian poetry in the Anthropocene, Kelly and Lobo's work on tidal country and cultures in North Australia, Bruno Latour's examination of how Gaia developed from thinking with islands, and Laura Watt's work with Orkney Islanders. In all these cases, and many, many more, we don't think we're just talking about critical theory in the Anthropocene. We think it matters that these examples, and as I say, many, many more, draw upon and engage with the figure of the island and islanders. These aren't on the periphery in such debates and developments. The island isn't a blank space, awaiting the insertion or parachuting in of some philosophical reasoning. Rather, working with and invoking certain island imaginaries, island relational entanglements, affordances, and feedbacks in particular, becomes generative for the development of patchwork approaches and resilience approaches. After establishing that engaging islands and islanders in the Anthropocene is seen as highly productive for the generation of relational ontologies, those of resilience and patchworks, thereby disrupting modernist frameworks of reasoning and a telos of linear progress, we now turn to how island-orientated work is productive of distinctive relational approaches to epistemology, that is, ways of knowing or registering the Anthropocene, what we are calling those of onto-epistemology. In a non-modern framework of thought, questions of epistemology are not entirely separate from those of ontology, but are onto-epistemological. Knowing is not a product of passive reflection, but of being itself. Here we seek to suggest that island-orientated approaches to epistemology can be approached heuristically by demarcating two modes of onto-epistemological understanding. Firstly, those of correlation, where there is a direct relation or registration of effect, depending upon the affordances of the entity concerned. In this case, we can think of the island as the emblematic sensing or correlating machine of the Anthropocene, the canary in the coal mine that registers and senses transforming planetary change. At the other end of the scale of onto-epistemologies is that of storiation, where the effects circulate in ways which problematise modernist constructions of linear time and space much more dramatically and much more explicitly. Central to both correlation and storiation is again how islands are worked with as important sites of relational entanglements in order to generate new approaches to knowledge and understanding, ways of registering the Anthropocene. Both approaches to knowledge depart from key assumptions of the modern epistemic imaginary, and they are both material, post-human, and more than human in orientation. Where distinctions can be drawn heuristically between them is in how they approach, register, or read the Anthropocene. Correlation is a relational onto-epistemology which relies heavily upon patterns of repetition and stable relations of surface effect. So, for example, the massive interest in changing patterns of island ecologies or the evolutionary pathways of island life as they degrade under transforming conditions. Here, island life and island cultures emerge as key figures for developing approaches which sense and register the Anthropocene for the wider world, illustrated well in how the island has become symbolised as the emblematic canary in the coal mine of the Anthropocene. And this emerges because of that dominant trope of the island being the emblematic sites of relational entanglements, affordances and feedbacks. It's particularly sensitive to transforming planetary or environmental conditions, enabling it to be the registrar and the canary in the coal mine. By contrast, storiation offers a more speculative, disruptive and generative set of openings. This is illustrated in recent critical framings which draw widely upon island life and cultures to foreground how the traces, hauntings and legacies of modernity, and in particular colonialism, are not over but profoundly constitutive of the present. Here we see island scholarship and islands feeding widely through into things like contemporary critical black studies, which draws very heavily upon certain island scholars, as we'll see. So turning to the logics or analytics of correlation and storiation in more detail, start off with correlation. Contemporary Anthropocene thinking is fundamentally marked by new approaches which seek to affirm the enabling powers of more than human relations. For famous authors today like Bruno Latour, Nigel Clarke, Catherine Yusof or Timothy Morton, the power of the Anthropocene or Gaia or the lithosphere or hyperobjects like global warming, whilst too great for the human intellect to grasp in modernist forms of command and control, enable new forms of thinking and responsivity to emerge. Although Anthropos may have forged the road to the Anthropocene, the tables are turned. Our transforming planet is setting the pace, revealing to us the overwhelming power and forces of more than human relations. Humans are now tasked with following and responding to these forces, having a more humble role, to learn how to better correlate and sense and register what the transforming planet is telling us. The problematic becomes that of how to listen and how to become aware. Thus, the sciences of correlation and the need to develop new methods and approaches of onto-epistemology, correlational technologies, have thereby come to the fore. We've examined this elsewhere in a publication in 2020 in Island Studies Journal. But key to the onto-epistemology of correlation is the capacity to see, sense or register processes of becoming beyond those given directly in appearance. That's why island ecologies and changing island ecologies and island environments become so central. They are a way of registering and sensing transforming conditions. Correlation is thus indirect, the registration of one entity, force or intensity in the changes in appearance of another. Correlation approaches depend on contextual relations and regularities, where experiential knowledge enables signs and signals to be read, as indexing or registering another, often unseen, changes. For example, a dog barking in the night might alert someone to an intruder, the bark thus registering, indexing or revealing something that would otherwise go unseen. Correlational forms of knowing or sensing thus enable a wide spectrum of interactions in the human and non-human world, and are understood to inform the interactive evolutionary processes of life itself, as life, exemplified often in these debates by island life, correlates in ecosystem processes of mutual adaptation or degradation. Correlation is not specific to human knowledge systems, and in modernity was long sidelined in favour of the truths generated by the laws of causation. But after the end of the world imagined in modernist ways, correlational approaches have proliferated and increasingly garnered the attention of policymakers and academics, and for this reason they have often been drawn to island practice and imaginaries, from where these forms of working are understood to be more central to everyday life. As Elizabeth de Loughrey notes, islands have become vital interpretants in the Anthropocene for mapping and modelling indirectly through the registration of effects, the impact of complex transformations in planetary conditions. Islands, as we've said, are often seen as the canaries in the coal mine because they are widely understood as small and extremely sensitive to catastrophic climate change and such forces as atmospheric pollution, rising sea levels, and plastic pollutants. There is this massive interest, intensified interest, in changing island ecologies, evolutionary pathways, and degradations as revealing and registering the Anthropocene. Thus, again, there is something to working with island affordances and properties that matters for the development of Anthropocene thinking. In this case, a way of knowing or registering the Anthropocene through the correlational onto epistemologies. Islands are not simply blank spaces in these developments, devoid of meaning, simply awaiting the parachuting in and testing out of correlational onto epistemologies. Rather, we argue that working with islands as emblematic sites of relational entanglements, affordances, and feedbacks has been crucial for the generation of correlational analytics in Anthropocene thinking more generally. We need turn no further than Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, because as she pointed out, it was the ecologies, affordances, and properties of islands and their surrounded ocean which brought the Anthropocene into the consciousness of the wider world, as she says, in the first place. It's important here to register how the island, as a key register for climate change, shifts the focus to sensing and correlation, rather than a modernist ontology of causation, as this is central to the importance of islands as instruments for non-modern ways of working in the Anthropocene. Correlation relies on causal laws or regularities, but the key aspect is that these are secondary to correlation rather than primary. As Latour argues, correlation epistemologies are not about essences or entities, but relations. The causal becomes background to the relational effects which are foregrounded. In the classic trope of the canary in the mine shaft, the problem of carbon monoxide is not addressed at the level of causation, predicting it or preventing it from appearing or solving the problem afterwards, but through developing a method of signalling the existence of poisonous fumes and of increasing human sensibility through the power of correlation. Along with island ecologies and ecosystems, probably the most high-profile illustration of this in contemporary Anthropocene thinking is the widespread celebration of Indigenous islanders' own correlational abilities. Throughout international policy making and academic literature today, Indigenous islanders are regularly characterised through their capacities for correlation, seen as vital attributes for survival in the Anthropocene. As First Peoples worldwide say, Indigenous science and knowledge are based largely on bioindicators or natural signs. Learning from nature in this way is an integral part of the Indigenous worldview that all things are connected, and that nature, when respected, can be a benevolent part of the whole community. Indigenous islanders are currently characterised as possessing unique correlating and sensing expertise, lost to moderns. And I quote Robertson on this as an illustration of many. On these small atolls, the ocean and its rhythms, the endless sound of the waves breaking on the reef, and the tides constantly contracting and expanding around the islands like a heartbeat, feature in most aspects of daily life. Navigational skills have allowed a handful of people from these islands to align themselves in this ocean world and to predict sailing and weather conditions. Navigators have interpreted the formation and colour of clouds to identify islands over the horizon. Birds and certain species of birds would give an indication of the distance to land. Star paths were followed when travelling greater distances. Most impressively, ocean swells, reflected from faraway islands and reefs, would echo through the canoe and its navigator, and would be recognised like the face of an old friend. End quote. In such widespread perspectives of Indigenous islands today, this living and evolving knowledge of relational interaction is often understood as or previously relegated to Indigenous knowledge. However, the fact that correlational approaches necessarily take an algorithmic form of if this then that, if this happens then it reveals that, this has enabled the recent development of more high-tech computational approaches in which the island has come to the fore. The characteristics of islands in particular as enclosed relational spaces of interdependency are often said to make them by their very nature agile and ready spaces for the development of smart sensing technologies on islands, useful factors in becoming innovative testbeds for innovation. They can move quickly to trial and scale new technology, providing innovators big and small with real-world environments for testing new ways of working. How do you turn these islands into an internet of living things? A laboratory. Just add 500,000 sensors. In Spain's Balearic Islands, referred to in this statement, the movements and relational interactions of island life could become seen or datafied through their translation into digital sequences, via their registration through sensory equipment, now so cheap as to become increasingly ubiquitous. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is Singapore, where a Smart Island journal says, quote, making technology all pervasive, permeating every sphere of activity, Singapore became an intelligent island by year 2000. But technology does not cease to evolve, so Singapore has a constant focus on it and now has a 10-year plan to become the world's first smart island nation by 2025. Sensors will be rolled out across the country to further improve the quality of life for its citizens. Such digital sensing operates through the correlational logic outlined, enabling the unseen to be seen through the registration of effects, in these cases upon the material body of the sensor. Thus, the prevalence of correlational logics in an extremely wide range of practices today, where working with islands is widely understood as central to the generation of new approaches, and in the smart island trope, from the prolific use of big data combined with extensive networks of sensors detecting changing island coastlines and rising sea levels, to the remote sensing of coral bleaching around islands as a biosensor of environmental change, to the growing interest in algorithmic correlation with social media feeds to see emerging island disasters. Through such examples, and many, many more besides, we can see how working with islands as key sites for understanding relational entanglements and feedbacks produces novel forms and leads to the way for generation of correlational onto epistemologies in contemporary Anthropocene thinking. Whether it's Indigenous islanders, island ecologies, or more recent smart island technologies, the island emerges as this central way of sensing and correlating and registering the forces of the Anthropocene. Turning to storiation. Correlation approaches work to establish island onto epistemologies as crucial to survival in the Anthropocene. They generate forms of knowing that are capable of grasping entities as having attributes and affordances in relation, rather than possessing fixed and distinct essences. Correlation is dependent on regular reiterated patterns of interaction, island ecologies, Indigenous islanders' correlational perspectives, and smart island sensing technologies. Whilst different from the modern logics of causation, this logic of correlation therefore still operates to generate scalable forms of calculation, measurement, and comparison, like measures of ocean acidity as registers of global warming. As with our discussion of island-orientated ontology above, in relation to resilience and patchworks, onto epistemological work derived from island experience and imaginaries also takes a less modern or more disruptive form, which we are conceptualising as storiation. Storiation works with islands to speculatively bring to the forefront of thought intra-actions and effects, rather than the interrelations of correlation, through their afterlives and their ongoing and transformative traces. Storiation tends towards holding entities together and effects in ways that problematise and go beyond modernist framings of spatial and temporal locations of objects and events. As one of the key thinkers for storiation, Timothy Morton, argues, in the Anthropocene there is no away. What we do sticks, and objects and experiences can appear to us through their legacies and afterlives, which we can read in their ongoing material effects. The most obvious example of this, widely prevalent in the literature, is that there is no isolated island anywhere on the planet which has escaped global warming. There is no way. This powerfully illuminates how we all today live within the vast multidimensional forces of transforming planetary conditions. When we turn on the ignition of our car, buy a plastic bottle, or catch a plane, we contribute to what Morton calls the hyperobject of global warming, which unfolds through trillions of spatio-temporal relations. Some of these play out immediately, in intensified hurricanes hitting islands around the world every year. Others stretch out for hundreds of thousands of years, the length of time it takes for carbon to dissolve in the oceans surrounding the islands. Thus, in working with islands in particular, we come to see a world which holds strange attractors and interconnections rather than one of clear separations, linear causality, or hierarchy of branching trees. For authors like Morton, the effects of entangled relation mean that engaging islands can provide valuable insights into the afterlife of objects and events in ways which transform our previous understanding of them as isolated or contained. The future then acts back upon the past as the afterlife of relational effects continue to reverberate across time and space in strange, weird, or as Karen Barrett has written about on the Marshall Islands, quantum ways. Elizabeth de la Frey's Allegories of the Anthropocene foregrounds how feminist insights have played an important role in the development of the Storyation analytic. Examining the work of the Marshallese poet Kathy Jetnil-Kinger, apologies for if I've got that wrong, de la Frey opens up with the poem Tell Me, and I'll quote the poem here. Tell them about the water, how we've seen it rising, flooding across our cemeteries, gushing over the sea walls, and crashing against our homes. Tell them what it's like to see the entire ocean level with the land. For de la Frey, the key point for Anthropocene thinking about this poem is that it does not employ an aerial God's eye view of the tropical island, one which segments time and space in a modernist way. Moreover, the poetry works to deliberately minimise the island's historical participation in the arena of politics and science, to bring forward an allegorical disjuncture between the experience of place, we see what is in our backyard, and the abstract realm, we don't know, the politics of science. De la Frey's Allegories book thus draws upon feminist, post-colonial and indigenous perspectives, not only to challenge the mainland God's eye view, but to foreground how the narrative use of disjuncture and rupture, quote, demands a multiscalar method of telescoping between space, planet and place, island, end quote from de la Frey. So what de la Frey's book does is it challenges linear histories of past and events separated from the present, and works at uncovering other feminized roots and agents, telescoping together that which a modernist methodology seeks to exclude or disavow. For Storyation, what is of central interest here are the concern with traces, haunting, spectres, and the ongoing effects of coloniality and modernity as they play out in their everyday island life. Storyation as an analytic disrupts linear understandings of causality as much as non-linear stories of complex ordering from chaos. For Vicky Kirby, interactive life, again exemplified by island life, can be understood as textual, as life reads and writes itself, enabling storyation to be understood as weird, strange or spooky, in ways which foreground how the language of feedback effects fail to catch out entities do not pre-exist feedback effects or communication, but are constituted with them. In short, storyation holds together entities and relations, causes and effects, and operates to expand onto epistemological thinking. Onto-epistemological approaches of storyation seek to speculate from the world, from the island, rather than about it, and to move beyond subject or human-centred approaches to thought. In storyation, effects circulate in weird or strange ways, transforming our understanding of entities and of relations. Evolution on islands appears less as an increase in complex interrelational efficiencies, as it would do in something like resilience, as forms of being are perfected as they adapt for different environments, than a weird carnival of contradictions, holding and including freaks, accidents and mutations, and seeing these as fundamental to the working of systems and processes. One such example, perhaps the most emblematic of all the islands in the Anthropocene, is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a floating gyre of plastics, as Stacey Alimo says, roughly the size of Texas, containing approximately 3.5 million tonnes of trash, shoes, toys, bags, pacifiers, wrappers, toothbrushes, and bottles too numerous to count, end quote. As Alimo states, again, everyday ostensibly benign human stuff becomes nightmarish as it floats forever in the sea. The recognition that these banal objects, intended for momentary human use, pollute for eternity renders them surreally malevolent. End of quote. Objects and items can play fundamentally different roles, have very different lives and afterlives, but these can't be separated from each other. They are intimately connected in the analytical approach of storiation. And our point is, whether it's in the work of de Loffre or Timothy Morton, or here in the work of Stacey Alimo, the island becomes this holding site for illustrating how there is no away in the Anthropocene. The materiality of island life holds together what was the away of the mainland modernity. It registers in this mode of storiation. So here we can see that relational processes of emergence might be destructive rather than productive. But storiation as death work, as Deborah Bird-Rose stated, is still productive of worlds. The detritus of consumerism, like colourful plastic bottle caps, has an afterlife in which they pass from one modern human assemblage to another, to quote Alimo again. One bottle cap, such a negligible bit of stuff to humans, may persist in killing birds and fish for hundreds, thousands maybe, of years. There's something uncanny about ordinary human objects becoming the stuff of horror and destruction. These effects are magnified by the strange jumbling scale in which a tiny bit of plastic can wreak havoc on the ecologies of the vast seas. End quote. To repeat, there is no away and no past in the Anthropocene, and here storiation is not merely a way of seeing relations of environmental damage on islands. There is much of modernity that needs to be confronted through the tracing of legacies that are constitutive of the present rather than as part of the past. Christina Sharp's In the Wake does precisely this in developing an analytic of life in the wake of slavery and in highlighting that the effects of chattel slavery on Caribbean islands and its afterlives are ongoing in the present. To quote Sharp, these are questions of temporality, the longue durée, the residence and hold time in the wake. At stake, then, is to stay in this wake time towards inhabiting a blackened consciousness that would rupture the structural silences produced and facilitated by, and that produce and facilitate, black social and physical death. End quote. Thus, storiation, the material effects or registrations of being in the world, troubles separations of space and time of modernity, unlike approaches of correlation. It is through storiation that islands most powerfully enable the rewriting of modernity's attempts to construct a linear temporality, in which the past and the future point in opposite directions. In the Anthropocene, whatever they say is over or finished is very much still with us. This point is forcefully made by work in contemporary Black and Indigenous studies, which has increasingly drawn attention to how island tropes and island scholarship in particular has massively risen to the fore, and can be seen as generative for contemporary critical thinking. Again, as de Loffre said, the oceans surrounding the Caribbean islands foreground places where the haunting of the past overtakes the present subject. Such concerns are recurrent and regular in many contemporary publications, such as Tiffany King's The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, which draws heavily upon the Barbadian historian and poet Camille Brathwaite. Brathwaite's onto epistemology of dialectics not only profoundly disrupts mainland, continental and modern frameworks of space-time and binaries of human nature, it shows how Caribbean islanders emerge, literally as new forms of life, in the wake of colonialism. I quote Brathwaite's famous paragraph on dialectics. Why is our psychology not dialectical, successfully dialectical, in the way that Western philosophy has assumed people's lives should be, but dialectic, like our grandmother's, our nana's action, like the movement of the ocean she's walking on, coming from one continent continuum, touching another, and then receding, reading from the islands into the creative, perhaps the creative chaos of their future. End quote. Brathwaite's island onto epistemology illustrates well how storiation speaks of intra-action and the holding together of dynamic forces and attractions, not inter-reaction, between predefined and separate entities, as in the case of correlating approaches. So storyation is different. It holds together all the forces, whereas correlation seeks these regular patterns in order to be kind of quite predictive effects. Now, Brathwaite's Nana will surely at times stand back and critically reflect upon the conditions of colonialism, but the key point for Brathwaite's onto epistemology is that it's her daily routines and her embodied movements themselves which are the dynamic forces holding in, living on in and maintaining the legacies of the wake of colonialism. There is no critical separation, no binaries or linear understanding. The situation is one of a profound dynamic holding together of hauntings and traces, as he says, receding, reading from the islands into the perhaps creative chaos of their future. This comes out particularly well in the tropes which Brathwaite employs to characterise colonialism on islands. Tidal Alexis thus speaks of how the focus upon intra-action deeply problematises modern notions of separate entities, predictive time and flat space, instead favouring a more speculative process of thought that decenters the subject, starting from island and islander materiality itself. For Tiffany King, Brathwaite is the key figure for understanding how island life lives on in the wake of colonialism, and life in general lives on in the wake of colonialism. And to quote, his old woman of Caribbean history engaged in the morning ritual of sweeping, who walked on the water with sand in her toes, end quote from King, bears powerful witness to the ongoing praxis and meanings of what it means to be a blackened human in the wake of slavery and the legacies of colonialism in the Anthropocene. As King makes absolutely clear, Brathwaite could not have developed his powerfully influential approach without working with islands, and it's why Brathwaite and other scholars like Glisson for Patchworks are rising to such prominence in contemporary critical black studies and Anthropocene thinking. And that's centrally because in mainland or continental thinking, as King says, land is not the traditional element used to analogize black flux or think about dynamic, fluid and ever-becoming black diasporic subjectivity. Rarely does land invoke the kind of flexibility, elusiveness and trickster-like qualities that black diasporic life symbolises in the Western Hemisphere. Jackie Wang has also recently done some great work on thinking through this in relation to oceanic subjectivities and the way in which Fred Moten's work can be theorised in this way as well. But my simple point is that the figure of the island and the surrounding oceans is no longer on the periphery of these debates. It's driven to the centre island scholarship, island materialities for the development of new relational onto epistemologies, ways of registering and knowing in the Anthropocene. Thus, Brathwaite is a key figure in the critical tradition of working with islands, which is today powerfully drawn upon for the onto epistemology of storiation. As Edmund and Smith's Islands in History and Representation illustrates, I quote, "This refusal of islands to perform as required suggests ways in which they can be turned back against continents, offering a model of how to live complexly rather than through the simplifications and essentialisms that have characteristically been projected onto islands. The island moves to the centre in the development of non-modern ways of knowing in the Anthropocene." Now, I could be talking also here about the recent works of Carrie Wolf, Karen Barad, David Farray and Nigel Clark, which we all discuss at length in our book. But the central point here is that islands are understood as intensive or amplifying sites for registering the hauntings and traces of relations. The fact that there's no away in the Anthropocene, the outflows of capitalist consumerism and so on. They don't cut the past from the present. Storiations of the differentiating powers of colonialism, of the emergence of dialectic psychologies living on in the wake, of species long extinct, of the consumerisms that haunt islands in strange ways, storiations of how there is no away and no past in the Anthropocene. There is little doubt that the widespread contemporary interest in islands mirrors the rise of non-modern, relational, non-linear, and more than human thinking across many academic disciplines and policy practices. But we want to make the argument that the engagement with islands in many debates today is not merely caught up in the slipstream of contemporary social and philosophical trends, but is actually crucial to the ontological and onto-epistemological framing and tools with which the new epoch of the Anthropocene is being grasped. When we think of naturalists and scientists establishing the immanent ontological framing of life as relational, glissant enabling patchworks as a distinct process ontology of relational becoming, the tropes of island sensitivities and affordances registering climate change via correlation, and Braithwaite's thinking with islands as holding forces across the cuts of time and space, enabling storiation, islands are not on the periphery anymore, but central to the overarching problematic of the Anthropocene today. That is, moving beyond the modernist paradigm of thought and understanding. Again, we do not see islands as simply the illustrative figures for the Anthropocene, for global warming, sea level rises, intensifying hurricanes, nuclear and other boundary-defying pollutants. We don't see islands as only symbolic for the development of new Anthropocene ontologies and epistemologies. This would be to deny that certain geographical forms and cultures actually matter for the development of thought in the world. It would be to suggest that there really is a human-nature divide, where the material world plays no part whatsoever in the generation of thought. It's not deserts or mountains which are the key figures of the Anthropocene, or which are widely drawn upon for the development of Anthropocene thinking. It is islands. We believe that this is because the island is a key figure for understanding what Claire Colebrook and Jamie Weinstein and Eva Garrard have variously called the central problematic of relational entanglement, which pervades contemporary Anthropocene thinking. To date, many authors have written about islands in the Anthropocene, but they have not taken as their key or overriding focus how working with islands as the originary and liminal sites of relational entanglements and feedbacks is also driving thought and practice today. Not only thinking about but with islands has become a key resource for the development of non-modern relational ontologies and onto-epistemologies in the Anthropocene. This places a particular importance upon islands themselves as key areas of thought, pushing what was once a rather peripheral field of study, island studies, to the forefront of interdisciplinary thought in the Anthropocene. We're really not sure that either island studies or Anthropocene thinking has fully grasped the depth and extent to which this is taking place. The focus of much critical island studies still largely remains within the confines and parameters of how the modern episteme reductively grasps islands, and the associated purpose of research being to foreground the importance, the critical reality, of more disruptive relational ontologies and epistemologies. Yet it is not least because the development of relational approaches is in the world, associated with an increasingly widespread receptivity to these patterns of social thought and ways of knowing, that we think some of the key stakes for island scholarship now need to be updated. To put this succinctly, the figure of the island is playing an important and generative role in a very broad range of fields. Islands are not on the periphery anymore, and of either scholarship or international policy making. We suggest, therefore, that there is now a need to not only critically focus upon how the modern episteme reductively graphs islands, to be clear, this is obviously still important, but to also establish a new, open and convivial critical research agenda, focused upon how islands are being enrolled in the Anthropocene as key sites for understanding relational entanglements, in and for the generation of many different forms of relational ontology and ways of knowing. As noted, our personal approach to this broader critical agenda is less one of stressing what island thinking and practices should be, and more about analytically drawing out and examining the various ways in which these conceptualizations are today being developed in and for Anthropocene thinking. Central to this, as we said earlier, is how working with islands or relational thought per se is not one homogeneous other to modernist or mainland approaches. And so we think it's really important to start a new conversation about how we engage in working through the rich variety of possibilities and opportunities that these approaches afford. In this talk, and in the book that we've written as well, we've heuristically distinguished the analytics of resilience, patchworks, correlation and storiation, resilience and patchworks being prevalent relational ontologies, which work with and draw upon islands for the generation of Anthropocene thinking, correlation and storiation being prevalent epistemologies or onto-epistemologies, which again foreground the importance of working with islands, engaging islands and island scholarship for the generation of Anthropocene thinking more generally. But of course, and no doubt, there will be many other ways of examining why and how the figure of the island is being brought into relational thought in contemporary Anthropocene thinking. In no way do we suggest that our book and the approach we're developing is the only way. In fact, the opposite. It's precisely because we think there are probably other ways that we want to start this Anthropocene Islands broader initiative. So we just see our approach as an initial opening or a beginning for a broader critical agenda for island studies in the Anthropocene. In order to stimulate this agenda, I'm going to be doing a number of things. The first, starting next year in 2021, is to set up a new Anthropocene Islands reading group, which is led by Cassia Micah and myself. Each month we will read a key text which enables us to think through the question of why and how islands and islanders are being drawn upon for the stimulation, generation and development of Anthropocene thinking. David Chandler and myself also now have an ongoing section in Island Studies Journal called Anthropocene Islands, where many people have already submitted abstracts and full papers, and we're in the process of reviewing those at the moment. There is also an island philosophy email list to stimulate debate, and please email me if you're interested in that. And of course, we are giving many talks at conferences and events, particularly in this Zoom era. And we will be organising our own sessions at conferences and workshops and events in the future. So thank you for listening to this talk. I want to restate, this is just the approach that David Chandler and myself are taking to the question of why and how the figure of the island and islanders has risen to such powerful prominence. We don't think that Anthropocene scholarship or island studies, even though they regularly write about each other, has fully got to grips with the stakes of this engagement. That the figure of the island and islanders is proliferating and being engaged in so many ways for the generation of non-modern relational thinking and approaches. We think, as I say, it was inevitable that once relational entanglements and a waning faith in the human nature divide came about as central to Anthropocene thinking today for so much scholarship and practice, that such approaches would be turning to certain geographical forms to help them work through this problematic. And thus the island, we argue, has emerged as a, if not the, central figure for the development of Anthropocene thinking. Thank you. Please do contact me if you would like to be involved or know more.